So with our last chunk of time that we have thus far mainly focused on intelligence, though we talked a little bit about weight. But of course, there's a huge wealth of research on the various behavioral traits that are hereditary or heritable. And I thought we might as well talk about some of the biggest ones, the most surprising ones, the most important ones, and how they're heritable. So what comes to mind when you think about that?
Yeah, well, backing up a bit, I think it's amazing that we've gone from the 70s, when I started graduate school, where nothing was thought to be heritable, to now
Right.
recognizing that everything is heritable. In fact, if you were to sometimes have a PhD student say, "Oh, well, this trait hasn't been studied. Maybe we should do a genetic study to see if it's heritable." You're wasting your time. If that's all you want to know, is I can tell you it's going to be heritable. You need to ask more interesting questions, like the developmental questions or interactions with the environment. So, I think that is important to mention. Everything is heritable. But now you're asking about what's most surprising. I think what surprised people the most was that the two things you just mentioned. One is the nature of nurture, that is environmental measures that we use in psychology and assume they're environmental because we call them environmental, that they must be environmental, but they actually all show genetic influence. I think that's an amazing finding. And then you start to think about why, and that's interesting. It's because they're not measures of the environment out there. They're measures of our experience with the environment, and our genetic propensities are part of that. And then the other one that was very interesting, I think, is this non-shared environment. That's not a genetic finding. That's saying genetics helps us understand about the environment. But the
Well,
thing
then
about
maybe another question that might better get at something novel for me and our listeners is what are the specific dimensions of, say, personality that have been isolated and determined to be heritable? So is this something like things like general disposition to being happy or angry or concerned about others? What are the sorts of dimensions of personality that have been studied like this?
yeah. Well, first of all, though, everything's heritable. So there's not going to be much in it. I can tell you, just like I can say vocabulary is more highly heritable than memory, but they're still massively heritable. And the same thing's true with personality. There's some aspects of personality, like I studied infancy in temperament. And shyness, listeners might be surprised to hear, is one of the more highly heritable temperamental traits in infancy. And but on the whole, what's been studied in personality is often summarized as the big five, with that factors. There are hundreds of traits that have been studied. You started mentioning some of them, but they kind of go together in five packages, and it goes with the acronym OCEAN. O is for am I blocking on this? Um, openness to experience. It means like curiosity and that sort of thing. And C is conscientiousness, which is related, say, to school achievement. And E and N are the big two of the big five: extroversion and neuroticism. And extroversion is broader than just being sociable. It has to do with being outgoing, sort of dominant. It incorporates a lot of traits. And neuroticism isn't being neurotic. It has to do with emotional lability, ups and downs and that sort of thing. And when you talked about anxiety, neuroticism is essentially its psychopathology component is anxiety. And that is extremely highly, it's almost the same thing genetically as depression. But that could be because some people said, you were saying you experienced both anxiety and depression in your family. But in some ways, George Brown in England has been famous for saying anxiety almost always precedes depression. But, be that as it may, they're highly genetically correlated. So what did I miss? O is openness to experience. C, conscientiousness. E, extroversion. A is something. And N is neuroticism. Agreeableness. A is agreeableness. And the reason that didn't come to mind is I always, for my dissertation back in 1974, I wanted to come up with traits that weren't heritable. So I asked psychologists, what do you think wouldn't be heritable? And they would come up, a lot of them mentioned things like kindness, agreeableness, and it does seem to me that's something parents, like I value that a lot in my kids. And so I thought that wasn't going to be heritable. Turns out it's just as heritable as everything else. So there's a little bit of evidence extroversion and neuroticism are a bit more heritable than these others, but there's not much in it. The larger point is they're all heritable.